April 14, 1943. The tropical sun beat down relentlessly on the bustling naval base at Rabaul, New Britain, the Japanese Empire's southern stronghold in the Pacific. In the humid command offices, high-ranking officers moved with purpose, their white uniforms crisp despite the oppressive heat. Among them was the most legendary figure in the Japanese Navy, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, the man who had masterminded the devastating attack on Pearl Harbor just 17 months earlier. Yamamoto was a man of contradictions, a Harvard-educated strategist who spoke fluent English, who had warned his superiors that war with America would be a disaster, yet who had executed Japan's initial triumphs with ruthless precision. Now, with the tide turning against Japan in the Solomon Islands campaign, Yamamoto was embarking on a morale-boosting inspection tour of forward airfields. His itinerary was meticulously planned. He would fly from Rabaul to the island of Bougainville, visiting units battered by recent Allied advances. But what Yamamoto and his staff didn't know was that American cryptanalysts had intercepted and decoded his travel plans. In a sweltering Quonset hut on Guadalcanal, 400 miles southeast, a team of U.S. Navy codebreakers stared at the decrypted message in disbelief. It wasn't just any itinerary, it was a golden opportunity. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, the Allies had a chance to strike directly at the architect of their greatest humiliation. The message revealed that Yamamoto would be airborne in just 4 days, traveling in a vulnerable transport plane with minimal escort. The decision was made at the highest levels. Yamamoto had to die. Operation Vengeance was born, a daring, high-risk mission that would pit a handful of American fighter pilots against the cream of the Japanese Air Force, all to eliminate one man who symbolized Japan's naval might. This was no ordinary combat patrol. This was assassination by air power, a bold stroke of strategic vengeance that would send shockwaves through the Pacific theater and boost Allied morale at a critical juncture. But pulling it off would require precision planning, cutting-edge intelligence, and pilots willing to fly 1,000 miles round-trip through enemy territory on a mission where failure wasn't an option. The story of Operation Vengeance begins not with pilots or planes, but with the quiet genius of American codebreakers. In the years leading up to Pearl Harbor, the U.S. Navy had been working tirelessly to crack Japan's diplomatic and military codes. By early 1943, they had achieved a breakthrough with the Japanese Navy's operational code, known as JN-25. This wasn't the famous diplomatic code broken before Pearl Harbor, but the day-to-day cipher used by the Imperial Japanese Navy for routine communications. It was a monumental achievement, but cracking the code was only half the battle. The real magic came in exploiting it without alerting the Japanese that their secrets were compromised. At Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor, under the command of Captain Joseph Rochefort, a team of linguists, mathematicians, and Navy officers worked around the clock, translating and analyzing intercepted messages. These weren't glamorous spies in trench coats. They were brilliant minds hunched over typewriters and codebooks, piecing together fragments of enemy intent from seemingly innocuous traffic. Rochefort's team had already provided invaluable intelligence during the Battle of Midway, where their decrypts revealed the Japanese carrier strike force's target. Now, in April 1943, they struck gold again. The message they intercepted was routine on the surface, a notification from Japanese naval headquarters about Yamamoto's upcoming inspection tour. But the details were precise. Departure from Rabaul at 0600 Tokyo time on April 18. Arrival at Balalay Airfield near Bougainville at 0800, traveling in 2 Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers escorted by 6 Zeros from the elite 204th Kokutai. To the Codebreakers, this was dynamite. Yamamoto wasn't just any admiral. He was the brain behind Japan's naval strategy, the man who had orchestrated the surprise attack that brought America into the war. His death could disrupt Japanese command structure, demoralize their forces, and send a powerful message that no one was safe, not even their most revered leaders. The decrypted message raced up the chain of command. From Rochefort's team, it went to Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, who immediately recognized the strategic value. Killing Yamamoto wouldn't win the war overnight, but it could create chaos in Japanese naval operations at a time when the Allies were gaining momentum in the Solomons. Nimitz consulted with his superiors in Washington, including Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox and Chief of Naval Operations Admiral Ernest King. The decision was clear. The opportunity was too good to pass up. But there was a catch. Executing the mission without compromising the code-breaking operation was paramount. If the Japanese suspected their communications were being read, they would change codes, blinding American intelligence overnight. The mission had to look like a lucky interception, not a targeted assassination. Every detail had to be planned to maintain the illusion of chance encounter. With Nimitz's approval, the mission was handed to Major John Mitchell, commanding officer of the 339th Fighter Squadron, part of the 347th Fighter Group based on Guadalcanal. Mitchell was a seasoned pilot with combat experience in the Solomons, known for his tactical acumen and cool head under pressure. At 39, he was older than many of his pilots, but possessed the experience and authority needed for such a high-stakes operation. Mitchell's challenge was immense. The intercept point was 400 miles from Guadalcanal, deep in enemy territory near Bougainville, putting the round-trip distance at nearly 1,000 miles. The aircraft had to fly low to avoid radar detection, navigate through Japanese-held islands, and arrive at the exact coordinates at the precise time, all while conserving fuel for the return trip. And they had to do it without radio communication to avoid alerting Japanese listening posts. Mitchell chose the Lockheed P-38 Lightning for the mission, and it was the perfect aircraft for the job. The twin-engine fighter was the only American plane with the range, speed, and firepower needed for such a long-distance intercept. With external fuel tanks, a P-38 could fly over 2,000 miles, more than enough for the round trip. Its 2 Allison V-17110 engines provided reliable power, and the tricycle landing gear made operations from Guadalcanal's rough coral strip easier than for single-engine fighters. But the P-38's real advantage was its armament. Each aircraft carried 4 50-caliber machine guns and 1 20-millimeter cannon in the central nacelle between the booms, concentrated firepower that could shred a transport plane in seconds. The pilots selected for the mission were among the best in Mitchell's squadron. Leading the killer flight of 4 P-38s tasked with actually shooting down Yamamoto's plane were Captain Thomas Lanfield, Jr., a 25-year-old ace with 4 victories already to his credit, and First Lieutenant Rex Barber, just 23 but already a skilled combat pilot with a reputation for precision. Flanking them were First Lieutenant Besby Holmes and Second Lieutenant Raymond Hine, both experienced and reliable. 12 additional P-38s would provide high cover, watching for Japanese interceptors that might challenge the mission. The planning sessions were intense. Mitchell pored over maps, weather reports, and intelligence updates, plotting a circuitous route that would take the P-38s out to sea, around Japanese radar stations, and back in toward Bougainville from an unexpected angle. The intercept point was set for the western coast of Bougainville, just as Yamamoto's flight approached from the northwest. Timing was everything. Arrive too early, and they'd be sitting ducks. Too late, and the Admiral would be on the ground. Fuel calculations were critical. Each P-38 would carry two 165-gallon drop tanks, plus internal fuel, but they had to release the drop tanks before combat to maintain maneuverability. The math was unforgiving. Fly 600 miles out, fight, then limp 400 miles back on fumes. Mitchell designated 2 aircraft as spares in case of mechanical trouble, knowing that aborting the mission wasn't an option once airborne. The pilots trained relentlessly. They practiced low-level navigation, formation flying at wave-top height, and quick transitions from cruise to combat. They studied silhouettes of the Betty bomber and Zero fighters, learning to identify them instantly even in the confusion of battle. Radio silence was drilled into them. No chatter, no position reports, nothing that could be intercepted. On the morning of April 18, 1943, the tropical dawn broke over Henderson Field on Guadalcanal with deceptive calm. The air was heavy with humidity, the scent of jungle and aviation fuel mingling in the breeze. 18 P-38 sat ready on the coral strip, their twin booms gleaming in the early light, pilots already strapped in and running final checks. Mitchell walked the line one last time, speaking quietly to each man. His words were simple, but carried the weight of command. This is it. Stay low, stay together, and when you see the bombers, give them everything you've got. At 700 local time, the engines roared to life, the distinctive growl of the Allisons echoing across the airfield. One by one, the lightnings lifted off, forming up over the slot, the dangerous stretch of water between Guadalcanal and the northern Solomons. Mitchell led from the front, his P-38 christened Scrooge, slicing through the air at 50 feet altitude. The formation flew southwest into the rising sun, hugging the wave tops to avoid radar detection. Salt spray occasionally dotted the windshields, and the pilots strained to see over their instrument panels. Navigation was by dead reckoning. Compass, stopwatch, and map. No room for error. The first hour passed without incident, the P-38s maintaining strict radio silence. Then, at the halfway point, trouble struck. 2 aircraft developed mechanical issues, one with a drop tank that wouldn't feed properly, another with an overheating engine. Mitchell made the call, abort and return to base. The spares took their place, and the mission continued with 16 fighters. As they approached the turn point south of Kolombangara Island, the pilots caught their first glimpse of enemy territory. Japanese coast watchers dotted the islands, their signal fires a constant threat. But the low altitude and circuitous route paid off. The formation slipped through undetected. Now came the hardest part, the 200-mile leg north toward Bougainville. The pilots were fatigued from hours of intense concentration, their eyes burning from scanning the horizon for threats. Fuel gauges dipped lower, the external tanks nearly empty. Mitchell glanced at his watch. Time was perfect. They were on course for interception at 0935 local time. Over the radio, still silent in their headsets, the tension built. Then, at 0927, the lead element spotted them, 2 Betty bombers lumbering northwest at 6,500 feet, 6 Zero fighters in loose formation above and behind. It was Yamamoto's flight, right on schedule. Mitchell's heart raced. The plan was working. He signaled the formation to climb, the P-38 surging upward like arrows from a bow. The Zeros spotted the Americans immediately, their radial engines glinting in the sun as they peeled off to intercept. Mitchell's high cover flights engaged the fighters, P-38s and Zeros twisting in a furious dogfight 10,000 feet above the bombers.
Tracer rounds stitched the sky, the sharp cracks of machine gun fire echoing across the water. But the killer flight broke through. Lanfear and Barber dove on the lead Betty, their .5 calibers and 20mm cannons roaring. Shells tore through the bomber's thin skin, the right engine erupting in flames. The Betty rolled violently, then plunged into the jungle on Bougainville's western coast, vanishing in a plume of smoke. Lanfear claimed the kill, but Barber, circling back, saw the crash and knew it was catastrophic. The second Betty dove for the deck, skimming the treetops in a desperate bid for safety. Holmes and Hine pursued, their guns blazing. The bomber's left engine caught fire, and it belly-landed in the shallow water off Moila Point, disintegrating on impact. Vice Admiral Watome Ugaki, Yamamoto's chief of staff, survived the crash, but the admiral himself was gone. Above, the dogfight raged. The Zeros were skilled, pressing home attacks with suicidal determination, but the P-38's concentrated firepower gave them an edge. Mitchell's high cover kept the escort fighters occupied long enough for the killers to escape. Hine took a hit, his lightning trailing smoke as he limped south. The rest of the formation disengaged, dropping remaining fuel tanks and turning for home. The return flight was a gauntlet of fatigue and fear. Fuel was critically low. Some pilots nursed their engines on reserve tanks, praying for Guadalcanal to appear over the horizon. Japanese fighters pursued sporadically, but the Americans' low altitude and speed kept them at bay. They landed back at Henderson Field just after noon, the coral strip scarred by fresh prop wash. Mitchell taxied to a stop, his hands trembling on the stick. The mission had succeeded. Yamamoto was dead. But victory came at a cost. Hine's P-38 ditched off Guadalcanal's coast. He was rescued by a destroyer, but the aircraft was lost. Initial claims were high, 3 bombers and several Zeros, but post-war analysis confirmed 2 bombers destroyed, with Yamamoto confirmed killed in the jungle crash. The body was recovered the next day by Japanese search parties. Yamamoto had been hit by .5 caliber rounds in the shoulder and head, likely dead before the Betty impacted. His white-gloved hand still clutched his samurai sword, a poignant image of the warrior's end. News of Yamamoto's death was suppressed by Japanese command for a month, until May 21, when it was announced as a gallant death in combat. The cover story claimed his plane was hit by American fighters during a routine flight, omitting the targeted nature of the ambush. But in Allied circles, the triumph was immediate and electric. President Roosevelt praised the codebreakers and pilots, calling it a great victory. Morale soared across the Pacific theater. For the Japanese, Yamamoto's loss was devastating. He was more than a commander. He was a symbol, the strategic genius who had humbled America at Pearl Harbor. His absence left a void in naval leadership at a critical time, as Japan struggled to counter American island hopping. Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki took over temporarily, but the combined fleet never recovered its pre-Yamamoto cohesion. Operation Vengeance wasn't just a tactical success, it was psychological warfare. It demonstrated that nowhere in the Pacific was safe for Japanese high command, that American intelligence could strike at will. Japanese admirals became more cautious, more reliant on escorts, more hesitant to venture into forward areas. The mission's secrecy was maintained masterfully. To the Japanese, it appeared as a chance encounter, a lucky intercept by patrolling P-38s. There was no evidence of code breaking. The route and timing were plausible for routine reconnaissance.
The code JN-25 remains secure, continuing to provide invaluable intelligence for the remainder of the war. For the pilots, the aftermath was bittersweet.
Lanfear and Barber both claimed credit for the fatal shots, leading to a decades-long controversy. Lanfear, more vocal and well-connected, initially received sole credit and the Distinguished Service Cross. Barber, quieter but equally deserving, fought for recognition. Post-war analysis, including Japanese records and crash site forensics, credited Barber with the kill. His gunfire patterns matched the damage to Yamamoto's plane. Lanfear's claims were adjusted, though he maintained his story until his death in 1987. Mitchell, the mission commander, received the Navy Cross and was promoted, but he always credited his pilots and the Codebreakers for the success. The P-38 Lightning itself became a legend from Vengeance. Its long-range capability and concentrated firepower proved ideal for such special operations. The twin-boom design, once controversial, earned respect as a versatile weapon. Guadalcanal-based squadrons flew hundreds of similar long-range missions, but none matched Vengeance's audacity or impact. The human stories behind the mission add depth to the technical triumph. Rex Barber, the probable killer, was a farm boy from Oregon, just 23 when he downed Yamamoto. He flew 112 combat missions, survived the war, and later became a dentist in the reserves. Thomas Lanfear, son of a World War I ace, carried the controversy with him, but remained proud of the mission. John Mitchell went on to command a fighter group in Europe, earning the Silver Star before returning home to a quiet life. For the Codebreakers, anonymity was their reward. Rochefort, who orchestrated the decrypt, was shuffled to a desk job in Washington after Vengeance, his contributions downplayed due to inter-service rivalries. Only decades later did he receive the recognition he deserved, including the National Medal of Intelligence in 1984. Operation Vengeance marked a turning point in the Pacific War. Coming just months after Guadalcanal, it signaled American momentum. Japanese naval power, already stretched thin, suffered a leadership blow from which it never fully recovered. The combined fleet's aggressive spirit waned without Yamamoto's strategic vision. Allied advances accelerated from the Central Solomons to the Gilberts and beyond. Vengeance's legacy endures in military doctrine. It was one of the first targeted killings of a high-value enemy leader using special operations aviation, a precursor to modern drone strikes and precision raids. It demonstrated the power of signals intelligence in guiding kinetic operations, a principle that remains central to contemporary warfare. Ethically, the mission raised questions about assassination in war. Roosevelt authorized it as a legitimate military objective, but some officers privately wondered if killing a uniformed admiral constituted murder. The Japanese viewed it as barbaric revenge. Americans saw it as poetic justice for Pearl Harbor. In the end, Yamamoto himself had predicted such a fate, telling aides that if Japan went to war with America, he feared for his safety. He was right. Today, the story of Operation Vengeance is taught in military academies as a case study in integrated operations, intelligence, planning, and execution working in harmony. Memorials at Bougainville's crash site honor Yamamoto as a fallen warrior, while in America, the pilots of the mission are remembered as heroes who struck a decisive blow. Rex Barber's name is etched on the Yamamoto Memorial at Arlington National Cemetery, a quiet acknowledgement of the man who likely pulled the trigger. The mission's success came from ordinary men doing extraordinary things. Codebreakers toiling in secrecy, pilots risking everything on a long shot, commanders making life or death calls. Their courage turned intelligence into action, vengeance into victory. Operation Vengeance wasn't just about killing one man. It was about breaking the myth of Japanese invincibility, proving that even their greatest strategist could be reached. In the broader arc of the Pacific War, it was a turning point, a moment when the hunter became the hunted, and the empire that struck first learned the cost of awakening a sleeping giant. Yamamoto's death didn't end the war, but it accelerated its conclusion, saving countless lives on both sides by hastening Japan's defeat. The story reminds us that in war, intelligence is the ultimate weapon, and vengeance, when precisely targeted, can change history. As the P-38s returned to Guadalcanal that afternoon in April 1943, their mission accomplished, they flew not just for revenge, but for every American sailor lost at Pearl Harbor, every Marine killed on Guadalcanal, every pilot downed in the slot. Operation Vengeance was justice served from 6,500 feet, a bullet from the blue that struck at the heart of the enemy. The triumphant return of the P-38s to Guadalcanal on April 18, 1943, marked the beginning of what would become one of the most celebrated and controversial episodes in Pacific War history.
As the engines of the surviving Lightnings wound down on the coral strip, pilots climbed from their cockpits with a mixture of elation and exhaustion. Major John Mitchell, the mission commander, was the first to debrief his superiors, his voice steady but his hands betraying the adrenaline crash. Over lukewarm coffee in a canvas-walled briefing tent, he recounted the intercept. The 2 Betty bombers down, Japanese fighters engaged, and most importantly, intelligence confirming that Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto was aboard the lead plane. The news spread like wildfire through the island's outposts, from the fighter squadrons to the Codebreakers' Quonset huts. For the Marines dug in along the lines facing Japanese positions on New Georgia, it was vindication. For the sailors on destroyers patrolling the slot, it was payback for the carrier losses at Santa Cruz and the Eastern Solomons. But the true impact of Operation Vengeance would unfold far beyond the immediate theater, rippling through Japanese command structures, Allied strategy, and even the ethical debates of warfare. Yamamoto's death wasn't just the elimination of a single man. It was the decapitation of Japan's naval brain trust at a moment when the Imperial Japanese Navy most needed strategic clarity. To understand the full weight of this loss, one must appreciate Yamamoto's role in the war up to that point. Born in 1884 to a samurai family in the Nagaoka domain, Isoroku Yamamoto had risen through the ranks of the Imperial Japanese Navy with a reputation for innovative thinking and tactical brilliance. His education at the Imperial Japanese Naval Academy and Harvard University, where he studied oil refining from 1919 to 1921, gave him a unique perspective on America's industrial might, a foresight that made his warnings about a prolonged war with the United States all the more prophetic. Yamamoto had opposed joining the Axis powers and had argued vehemently against war with America, predicting that Japan could inflict a single crushing blow, but would ultimately be outproduced and outlasted. When forced to plan the Pearl Harbor attack, he did so with reluctance, viewing it as a necessary gamble to neutralize the Pacific Fleet long enough for Japan to consolidate its conquests in Southeast Asia. The success of Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, made Yamamoto a national hero overnight. The strike sank or damaged 8 battleships, including the USS Arizona, and killed 2,403 Americans, thrusting the United States into the war with a fury unmatched in history. Yamamoto's carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, sailed away unscathed, giving Japan 6 months of unchallenged dominance in the Pacific.
But the admiral knew this was temporary. "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve," he reportedly said after the attack, words that would echo through American propaganda for the duration of the war. By early 1943, the sleeping giant was wide awake. The Battle of Midway in June 1942 had been a catastrophe for Japan, with 4 fleet carriers lost, and Yamamoto himself witnessing the destruction from the bridge of the battleship Yamato. The Guadalcanal campaign, stretching from August 1942 to February 1943, had bled Japanese resources dry, with thousands of troops starving on the island while American forces held the airfield. Yamamoto's inspection tour to Bougainville was intended to rally his airmen, boost morale among units facing relentless American air raids, and assess the situation on the ground. Instead, it became his fatal journey. When Japanese search parties recovered Yamamoto's body the day after the ambush, the scene was one of dignified tragedy. The admiral's remains were found in the dense jungle near the crash site. His uniform charred, but his white-gloved right hand still grasping the hilt of his naval sword, a symbol of the warrior ethos that had defined his life. Autopsy reports, later declassified, confirmed death by multiple .50-caliber wounds, including a fatal shot to the head. Vice Admiral Natomi Ugaki, Yamamoto's chief of staff, who survived the second Betty's crash, was pulled from the shallow water off Moila Point with severe injuries, but lived to record his account in a diary that would become a post-war historical treasure. Ugaki described the attack as sudden and overwhelming, the P-38s appearing like demons from the mist. The recovery operation was shrouded in secrecy. Japanese authorities suppressed news of the admiral's death for a full month, announcing it only on May 21, 1943, as a heroic death in aerial combat. Even then, the official story claimed Yamamoto's plane was part of a routine flight caught by chance American patrol. The truth, that U.S. intelligence had targeted him specifically, was never admitted publicly during the war, preserving the JN-25 code's integrity.
The controversy between the two pilots simmered for decades, fueled by Lanfear's higher profile and initial sole credit from the military. Lanfear received the Distinguished Service Cross in 1943, while Barber got the Distinguished Flying Cross, a lower honor that rankled. The dispute even reached Congress in the 1980s, with Barber's advocates pointing to ballistic evidence from the crash site. In 1990, a joint Army-Navy review officially credited Barber with the downing of Yamamoto's plane, acknowledging Lanfear's role in the engagement, but resolving the kill attribution. Both men, who became lifelong friends despite the disagreement, passed away in the 1980s and 1990s, their legacy intertwined in the annals of aerial warfare. Major John Mitchell, the architect of the mission, downplayed personal glory, emphasizing the teamwork that made vengeance possible. "It was the Codebreakers who won this one," he often said in post-war recollections. "We were just the delivery system." Mitchell's leadership ensured the mission's success. His decision to fly low and silent, to engage only when the moment was right, minimized risks and maximized surprise. He went on to command the 339th Fighter Squadron through the end of the Solomons campaign, earning promotion to lieutenant colonel before rotating stateside. In civilian life, Mitchell became a successful businessman, but remained modest about vengeance, viewing it as duty fulfilled rather than fame earned. The Codebreakers, the unsung heroes of the operation, received even less fanfare, and initially some punishment. Captain Joseph Rochefort, whose team at Station Hypo decrypted Yamamoto's itinerary, was sidelined shortly after the mission due to Navy politics. Rival intelligence factions in Washington resented the Pearl Harbor-based team's success and maneuvered to reassign Rochefort to a lesser post in Washington. It was a bureaucratic knife in the back for the man whose insights had saved thousands of lives. Rochefort's demotion was reversed in 1944, and he retired as a rear admiral in 1947. But his contributions remained classified for years. Only in 1982 did he receive a long-overdue Navy Distinguished Service Medal, presented by a grateful service branch. His story highlights the inter-service rivalries that sometimes overshadowed wartime achievements, but also the quiet brilliance of signals intelligence. Operation Vengeance's strategic impact was profound and multifaceted. Immediately, it disrupted Japanese naval planning at a pivotal moment. Yamamoto had been pushing for a decisive fleet engagement to halt American advances in the Solomons, but his death left the combined fleet leaderless. Ugaki, though capable, lacked Yamamoto's charisma and strategic vision. He focused on defensive operations, while the aggressive spirit that characterized early Japanese tactics waned. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, the Marianas Turkey Shoot, saw Japanese carriers decimated without the bold maneuvers Yamamoto might have orchestrated. Historians debate whether his survival could have changed the war's outcome, but most agree his absence accelerated Japan's naval decline. Morally, Vengeance boosted Allied resolve. Coming amid the grueling Guadalcanal slog, it provided a much-needed victory. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, briefed on the mission's success, saw it as poetic justice for Pearl Harbor. In a fireside chat, he alluded to blows struck against the enemy leadership, without specifics to preserve secrecy. For American servicemen, the knowledge that the Pearl Harbor mastermind was dead, whispered through the ranks despite classification, fueled determination. Japanese morale, conversely, plummeted when the news broke. State media portrayed Yamamoto's death as a martyr's fall, but privately, officers feared American omniscience. Admirals became paranoid about their movements, relying on heavy escorts and radio silence that hampered coordination. The suppression of news for a month allowed rumors to fester, eroding confidence in the high command. Tactically, Vengeance validated long-range fighter operations.
The P-38's performance, flying 1,000 miles round-trip with combat, proved the viability of strike-and-fade missions. This influenced later operations like the Marianas Campaign, where P-38s and P-47s conducted similar intercepts. This mission also highlighted intelligence's primacy. Without JN-25 decrypts, Vengeance was impossible. The Navy's code-breaking efforts continued to pay dividends, from the Battle of Leyte Gulf to the submarine blockade that starved Japan's war machine. Controversies surrounding Vengeance extended beyond kill credit. Ethically, was assassinating a uniformed admiral legitimate? Roosevelt authorized it as targeting a high-value military leader, akin to killing Erwin Rommel in the desert. International law at the time permitted such strikes if the target was in a combat zone, and Yamamoto was en route to inspect frontline units. Critics, including some American officers, called it murder from the air, arguing it set a precedent for targeting leaders. The Japanese decried it as barbaric, but their own tactics, like kamikaze attacks later in the war, blunted moral outrage. Post-war, the debate faded.
vengeance is now viewed as a lawful act of war, justified by Yamamoto's role in planning aggressive operations. Another controversy involved the mission's secrecy. To maintain OPSEC, the full story remained classified until the 1970s. Initial press releases described it as a routine patrol, frustrating pilots like Lanfear who sought recognition. This delay meant Vengeance's heroism was overshadowed by flashier battles like Midway. Only with declassification did details emerge, vindicating the participants. The P-38 Lightning's role in Vengeance cemented its legacy. Often maligned early in the war for complexity, the Lightning shone in the Pacific, where its range and cooling system excelled in tropical conditions. Over 10,000 P-38s were built. Variants served through Korea and beyond. Vengeance's success spurred upgrades, like the P-38J with improved superchargers. Today, restored P-38s fly at air shows, evoking the twin-boom fighters that changed history. For the Solomon Islands theater, Vengeance accelerated the Allied push. With Japanese naval coordination disrupted, American forces captured Munda Airfield in July 1943 and Kolombangara in August. The Bougainville campaign followed, with Marines landing in November under lighter opposition than expected. By 1944, the Solomons were secure, paving the way for the Central Pacific Drive. Yamamoto's death echoed in Tokyo. Emperor Hirohito mourned him as a pillar of the Navy, and Prime Minister Hideki Tojo faced criticism for security lapses. The high command shifted toward defensive posture, abandoning Yamamoto's offensive doctrine. This conservatism contributed to defeats at the Philippine Sea and Leyte Gulf, where Japanese carriers fought without the daring Yamamoto advocated. Vengeance's intelligence legacy was equally enduring. The JN-25 break enabled ultra-like successes in the Pacific, paralleling Britain's Enigma work in Europe. Codebreakers like Rochefort and his successor Jasper Holmes used decrypts to ambush convoys, predict submarine patrols, and coordinate amphibious assaults. Post-war, these techniques birthed the NSA, with Vengeance cited as a foundational case study. The human cost, though light compared to other operations, was real. Lieutenant Raymond K. Hine, hit during the dogfight, ditched his P-38 off Guadalcanal and was rescued, but the strain of the mission left psychological scars. Pilots like Barber suffered nightmares of the burning Betty, haunted by the knowledge they'd killed not just an enemy, but a cultural icon. Japanese perspectives add nuance. Yamamoto was revered as a modern samurai, his death a national tragedy. Ugaki's diary reveals shock and resolve. He later led kamikaze operations, dying in 1945 aboard the battleship Yamato. Post-war Japanese historians view Vengeance as a turning point, accelerating naval decline. Memorials at the crash site honor Yamamoto with solemnity, a sobering contrast to Allied celebrations. In American memory, Vengeance is a footnote to grander narratives like Midway, yet its precision exemplifies special operations aviation. Films like Pearl Harbor 2001 dramatize it inaccurately, but documentaries and books like At Dawn We Slept by Gordon Prange capture its essence. Annual commemorations at Henderson Field, now Honiara International Airport, feature flyovers by restored P-38s, honoring the pilots who flew into history. Vengeance teaches that wars are won by intelligence and audacity, not just firepower. It humanized the enemy through Yamamoto's complexity, a reluctant warrior whose death didn't end the fight but shifted its momentum. For Barber, Lanfear, Mitchell, and Rochefort, it was duty done. For the Pacific, it was vengeance realized. The admiral who awoke the giant fell to the giant's resolve, a fitting epilogue to Pearl Harbor's infamy. As the Solomons faded into post-war peace, the echoes of those P-38 engines reminded all that in war, even giants can be felled by careful aim and unyielding will.